everyone. I am Pat Soldano. I am president of Family Enterprise USA. We advocate for generationally owned family businesses and their lifetime of savings in Washington, D.C., all sizes of business and all industries. We're really thrilled to have on this call today Whittier Trust, who supports the work of Family Enterprise USA. And the topic we're going to talk about today is core satellite approach to estate planning. This webcast explores strategies for sustaining and supporting family-owned businesses and members through a hybrid core satellite family ownership structure. The webcast couples the core model, where assets are placed in a trust to protect against financial threats and estate taxes, but may limit the next generation's autonomy, with the satellite approach, which offers flexibility but exposes assets to risks like divorce and lawsuits. So the webcast advocates for hybrid solutions, combining the benefits of both of those models to safeguard wealth while providing autonomy for family members to pursue entrepreneurial goals. So I'm very pleased to have with me today Brian Bissell, who is Senior Vice President and Client Advisor for Whittier Trust, and Caleb Silsby, who is Executive Vice President, Chief Portfolio Manager. So welcome, both of you. I'm going to turn it over to Brian, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about Whittier Trust.
Hi, Pat. It's great to see you again. Thank you so much for the introduction and for organizing the webcast today. Caleb and I are excited to talk about the core satellite approach to estate planning. But first, just wanted to thank you and Family Enterprise USA for the great work you guys are doing. We wholeheartedly believe in your mission to educate Congress on the impact that some of these tax laws are having on family businesses, and just how important family businesses are to the U.S. economy, but also to the moral fabric of our nation. For those on the call who aren't familiar with Whittier Trust, we are an investment and wealth management firm and the oldest multi-family office headquartered in the West. We are 200 professionals serving 500 families across 36 states with $21 billion of assets under advisement. Many of the families we work with are multi-generational family business owners. Some are generation one, and they're embarking on their first ever succession to the next generation and passing the business down to their kids. We also work with families who are in that next level where they are the siblings now running the business and looking down at generation three and thinking through how all of the cousins are going to come together and collaborate and cooperate around running the family business. We even have some businesses that are now on generation 6. So needless to say, we've seen a lot. While every family business and every family is unique and different, the challenges they face have a lot of similarities. We like to group these challenges into 2 categories, the qualitative and the quantitative. The quantitative being the numbers like revenue, expenses, EBITDA, and for the sake of this conversation, estate taxes. But the qualitative focuses more on the family dynamics and thoughts and feelings and values of individual family members. The real magic happens when the estate plan balances the positive outcomes of both of those categories. The approach Caleb and I will be discussing today is just one page of a very large playbook that we have, but we feel it does the best job in that balancing act. So without further delay, I'll let Caleb introduce the concept.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Pat. It's great to be here and great to talk about an interesting topic that's really evolved over a long period of time. So this is an experiential concept, right? Where if you tried to Google core satellite approach to estate planning, you may have come up empty. And it's really because this is based on the decades that Brian and I have spent working together at Whittier and all the families that we've seen over time and different attempts at estate plans, different attempts at trying to keep the family together through a document or multiple documents. And so I'll just introduce the core satellite approach. And I guess I'll start by saying that while every family is unique and every family is different, there are some core binding similarities across families. So the first one I would say is that most families want to see the family business or the legacy grow and grow over a long period of time. The second one is that they want to see a structure that promotes family harmony. So, you don't want the wealth to tear the family apart. We've all read about it. We've heard about it. Brian and I have seen it. You don't want that to happen. And then, as Brian mentioned, you want to allow for individual autonomy to some extent. So herein lies this concept of the core satellite approach. The core being a family legacy entity that is intended to last for a very long period of time. And so you can think of a family limited partnership or an LLC, or maybe it's real estate that the family wants to never sell, just to hold on to for multiple generations. So this is something that's binding the family together from an investment philosophy perspective and from a values perspective. So most families don't want to take too much risk with their core of the assets, but inevitably you have the next generation who has different views, different spending habits, different earnings potential, etc. And so you need to complement the core with what we would call satellites. So individual accounts that are somewhat left to the discretion of those individuals. And that allows for somebody to be entrepreneurial. Generally, the wealth was created because somebody took risks, somebody had a concentrated asset originally, and somebody was entrepreneurial. So that's probably in the DNA. It's probably in the bloodline somewhere. And you want to be able to make sure that you encourage that over time. So this core is going to be where the family invests together. The satellites are where each individual has autonomy over their own investments, and they can invest in a business. They can maybe invest in a more risky but higher return potential investment. They might have different spending needs. Maybe one person at the second generation has 3 or 4 kids, whereas another person at the second generation has 1 kid. So there's going to be unique needs at the next generation. We live in a world of opportunity. We also live in a country of unequal outcome. And so trying to have the same assets for every single member of the family has some pitfalls. So I will let Brian talk about an all core approach where a family didn't have the satellites. They just had everything in the core bucket. And then I'll talk about a family that just chose the all satellite approach. And you'll see, not surprisingly, those are going to be examples that don't work out. And then we'll merge the two together and talk about a family that effectively used this core satellite approach. And it's representative of a lot of families if you start to think about it and think about maybe your friends or other families that are in this situation. Brian?
Thanks, Caleb. Yeah, each of these approaches, the all core or the all satellite, they do have their strengths. And the family that I'm about to talk about was pretty hyper focused on the quantitative element of their succession planning, and they designed their estate plan to take advantage of the strengths of this all core strategy, which they took their family business and as part of the architecture of their estate plan, it made for the point in time when the patriarch passed away, 96% of the ownership in the shares went into a trust where an institutional trustee, which happened to be a large bank, oversaw and controlled the assets. So the surviving spouse became a beneficiary of the trust that hold, the core assets of that family. And, the benefits there was that a lot of asset protection elements came to play, that if there were any divorces in that next generation, it wouldn't be exposed there, any creditor protection or any lawsuits that would come about. The core business was in that vehicle and it was protected. It also had a nice estate tax avoidance element to it, that when the surviving spouse passes away, a lot of it is going to bypass the estate tax. So those are some of the strengths, but what happened and what some of the unforeseen consequences of that was it really stifled that next generation. It really didn't allow them to participate in any of the family's wealth because the surviving spouse is still alive today. She may live for another 15 to 20 years, and she has 96% of that beneficial interest in the core assets. There are no satellites. There are no ways really for the kids to benefit from that. And the kids now being in their 50s, other than asking their mom from time to time for financial support and financial help, and it's really put a strain on their family dynamic. There's a strain between the mom and the kids. The mom's remarried now, and that always can bring an interesting strain to a family dynamic. But the point being is, I think if they could do it all over again, I think there were some regrets that I don't think they intended for it to all be locked up in this family vehicle that the next generation will be able to benefit from it when their mother passes away. But they'll be late in life. They could be in their 60s or 70s at that point in time, and I don't think they kind of really thought that through. So,
Brian, I've seen similar situations. And is there resentment at that second generation level?
there is. It's a weird sort of mental space that it puts each of those kids in, because they loved their father and they still have a lot of love for the father he was, but they just can't understand why he would structure it this way. And my thought is that he probably didn't realize that it would play out this way. So there is some resentment, but there's still a lot of love for their deceased father.
Yeah, but they probably feel like their father didn't trust them with the assets, and
Yep, that's
it's
exactly.
all tied up.
Yep.
Brian, ultimately, what happens upon the death of the mother?
It does flow into trust. It stays in trust, and it's outside of her taxable estate, so that there's a good tax savings there, and the kids will then become beneficiaries of those trusts that are controlled by the institutional trustee. So they can benefit, and they'll gain more access. They'll still have to go through a corporate trustee and ask for permission for any sort of distribution, but they're going to have to wait, and it could take considerable amount of time.
So it sounds like the assets in the sort of this core structure have grown. They've been protected. They're saving on estate tax, but it's not benefiting the family, and the family is now focused on other issues that have manifested themselves because they grew up with a certain standard of living, thinking that they're going to replicate that standard of living for their kids, and they haven't been able to do so because it's all tied up. And now they resent the plan. They resent, the previous generation. So it sounds like there's some issues there.
Yep. So maybe we can shift to the all satellite approach and see what the strengths and weaknesses are there.
Okay, so here's the other side of the coin here. So familiar with the family, had 4 kids, and one of the kids very successful, tended to save a lot, and a couple of the other kids were spenders, didn't save as much, and took greater risks. So in this situation, G1, not knowing what would happen with the kids, but not wanting to have the assets tied up, just distributed everything to the next generation outright. But asked the next generation to work together, even though the assets were all split into individual pots, so just into these satellites. So what ended up happening was one of the siblings, like I said, saved a lot, has built wealth, and has multiplied what they were initially given. And then 2 of the siblings have really spent nearly all of the money, One of them has become somewhat depressed because they were accustomed to a certain standard of living, and now they're well below that. And the sibling who is successful and has saved a lot is now feeling responsible for the other siblings, but there isn't any safety net. There's no family legacy vehicle to fall back on. So this sibling feels like they're just caught in a really hard place. They're spending some time talking to their sibling about budgeting, some time talking to their spouse about, do I bail out the sibling who's overspent and made the wrong decisions? And so you can see it's a mess at the second generation level, but wait till you get to the third generation. So the grandparents are still alive and they're still seeing this play out. Now the third generation, you have some kids who are receiving the best education and having those opportunities, going on nice vacations. And then they have their cousins who, don't have those same opportunities. And so the grandparents are looking down, they're seeing some grandchildren that are having these opportunities, and they're seeing other grandchildren that just have rich cousins. And, the grandchildren aren't looking up and saying, wow, what an amazing legacy my grandparents had built. They're saying, how did this structure break down? And how did our family go from what was a wealthy family to now, having to ask aunts and uncles for support? So that's the all satellite approach. We all are aware of the riches to rags in 3 generations, and you want to avoid that unnecessary outcome. So now we'll talk about blending the two together, right? How do we get the best of both worlds? How do we protect the assets, mitigate estate taxes, have the assets growing in a way that's consistent with the family values and family approach to investing, but then how do we allow for some autonomy at the next level so that there isn't resentment going up? So that's this core satellite approach. You saw this coming. So the core satellite approach is you have this family legacy vehicle, and I mentioned earlier that it could be an LLC or a family limited partnership. I mentioned that it could be real estate that is intended to be held for a very long period of time. Whatever it is, it's a source of assets that are going to be for the collective benefit of multiple generations and are growing in a way that's consistent with what the family would want to see the assets grow. Okay, so coupling that with these satellite buckets where people have, individuals of the next generation are able to express their own individuality. They're able to take some risk. They're able to seek higher returning assets. They're able to be entrepreneurial, to start a business. So I'll talk about a family that applied this core satellite approach. The first generation sold their business. They actually sold it back to the employees, which was great. They did an ESOP. And that generated a lot of cash flow and a large portfolio over time. And what they did was they said, we'll keep that in an LLC, and we'll have that LLC be owned by several owners. So some interests in the LLC were owned outright. Some interests in the LLC were owned by irrevocable trusts for the benefit of the next generation. And some interests were owned by the grandchildren. And so what this allowed for was when the grandchildren were very young, they weren't taking any distributions. When G2 was in their formative years, they weren't taking any distributions. So for a while, this LLC was growing and growing and growing and growing. Then they got to the point where each member of the second generation was doing something different. And this was an entrepreneurial family. So you had 2 of the 4 kids that were starting their own businesses. And so when they wanted to start their own business, they took a distribution from the LLC, which meant that all members of the LLC received distributions at the same time. And that allowed for the investments to be individualized. So the one member who was starting a business, obviously was taking that, putting it into the business and being entrepreneurial. the distributions that came to the grandkids could go entirely into equities, right? All growth assets, because they had a very long time horizon. And then other assets that went to, other members of the family that might have been more conservative were able to invest it in a more conservative way. So what this meant was, as one individual within the family started to individualize the portfolio, everyone started to see the portfolio more individualized. As you started to see the family separate in terms of their goals and objectives, you saw the assets separate and meet those goals and objectives. But it still meant that there were significant assets growing in the core. So if somebody had a child who had special needs, there were still assets to support that. If there was somebody who took too much risk on a business and it didn't work out, there was still money to send the kids to college. And it meant that the siblings, when one sibling was investing speculatively, it didn't have a deleterious effect on the other siblings. It meant that the other siblings actually had more autonomy over their own slice of the pie at that time. So this worked out really well. The second generation continuously looks back to the first generation and is thankful. The third generation looks back to their grandparents and is recognizes the contribution and the legacy that was built there. The siblings are not fighting over the assets. They're not fighting over different choices. They recognize that there are different choices that are being made, and there are the documents and the structure provide for that. So every family has certain dynamics that are not perfect, but I think this is a pretty good example of why a core satellite approach works very, very well, and I think should be considered if you're thinking about passing on a family business or passing on wealth to the next generation and the generation beyond that.
So Caleb, my question would be, and I would think a lot of the people kind of in the satellite would say, okay, everyone has to take distributions if one person takes a distribution, because that's the laws. Well, what if one person is taking a lot of distributions and others aren't, and they don't want the distributions, and so someone is becoming a little more aggressive and taking a significant amount of distributions, it affects everybody. So are there rules within the LLC about, levels of distribution, how often you can take them, those kinds of things?
Yeah, so the devil's in the details, right? You have to think about how you're going to structure it over time. And, there's options. Obviously, there's distributions in kind, which could allow for, one member of the LLC to, you wouldn't necessarily have to pay taxes because one person's taking a distribution. The assets can stay invested. They're just now more invested for the lines of the family that were savers and less invested for the lines of the family that were more speculative. So I think that's part of the solution there. You could obviously buy out LLC interests. So there's flexibility and there's ways to approach that. But yeah, obviously, I think you're right, Pat. The more that you can anticipate some of these nuances, the more that you can be thoughtful about how to structure it and how to have the plan in place to alleviate any, sort of battles over discretion, right? You want it to be fairly clearly laid out for that next generation about what the plan is, but you want to anticipate some of these challenges that will come up.
Exactly. Okay.
Hi, Brian.
Yeah, so I just had a couple slides that are illustrations that help us show a lot of about what we were talking about in more of a picture form. So, this is one that we show to a lot of clients that are thinking through this core satellite strategy, and it paints the picture of what the goals and objectives are on the quantitative and the qualitative side. So, with the core assets, a lot of families, especially in the founding generation, sometimes their heads are so far, in the details in the sand of the business that they're not even aware of some opportunities that are available to us today. And one of those big ones is that there's a $13.6 million lifetime exemption amount that's available to every individual. So a married couple, that's 27 million plus, that you can move outside of your taxable estate. And that currently is only available to us until the end of 2025. And, Pat, we'll ask you what your feelings are on whether that gets extended or not. But for now, it's set to expire at the end of 2025. So this first illustration here shows if you were to take that $27 million exclusion from the estate tax, you can put some of your company's shares into a vehicle that goes outside of your taxable estate. And what we like about that is that any future growth is now happening outside of your taxable estate. So if your core assets start to appreciate and the business does well, and it's something that you can apply a generation skipping transfer tax exemption to as well, which allows it to move freely down the generational chain without getting a 40% bite taken out of it on each rung of that ladder. So just kind of generally speaking, this is what we're talking about here is put those core assets in the family in a vehicle out here that can support the satellite that could remain inside the taxable estate. And you manage around the size of what that is and give autonomy to each generation to do the same thing and move assets for their children and grandchildren as well. So that's kind of the game board that we play on and strategize around. And I think this next slide is what Caleb was, just sort of explaining, but here it is in picture form. If you want to talk more about that, Caleb.
Yeah, perfect. Just for those of you that are visual learners, thought it'd be illustrated to show a visual here. So you can see the core starts out fairly large relative to any of the satellites, but there should be existing satellites, and the core again is this family legacy vehicle. So an LLC or family limited partnership or something of that nature. And the satellites are individual accounts. So it could be a revocable trust, could be an irrevocable trust for the benefit of, could be an agency account, but there's different ways to structure at that point. The real point of this though is that the core is where the bulk of the assets should initially start. And ideally you're growing that core over time, as Brian said, outside of the estate. But there are satellites that are funded and it's clear as to the intentions and the values associated with those entities or accounts. And that over time, the core is going to fund the satellites. And so you're going to try and, you're trying to achieve the optimal combination for the family, whether that's growing the assets collectively or whether you just have to recognize that each kid is different and each family line is different, and that you need to have differing outcomes for each of the next generation, but then still preserving something for the third generation or beyond that is consistent with what the first generation wanted and sought out to accomplish.
Caleb, there was a question that one of the people that registered for this call asked, and I think this is appropriate time. I'm not sure whether it's you or Brian that should answer it, but let's assume that there are differing ownership groups between core and satellite companies. How are they connected?
So if there are different ownership groups of core and satellite companies, so usually it's a family business that's owned. So there's one single family business that's owned through the core. Now, if you have outside owners of that business, then they're going to have an entirely different plan, right? So this is just for, call it the Smith family or the Jones family, their ownership interest in their family business and thinking about, how to own that business. So I'd say, you want to keep it as simple as possible, keep the cap table as clean as possible, but know what your ultimate goal is, right? So the other sort of maybe hidden question there is, what happens if one person in the next generation works in the business and one does not? Which I think really relates to the core satellite approach, because you would have the core, which is the family collectively owning the business. And in this slide, you might have one satellite that's bigger. So you might have one of the members of the family that works in the business and really is growing the business. Or maybe they have a subsidiary within the business that they're in charge of. And you want to incentivize and reward that individual. So it's, fairness is not necessarily equality of outcome, right? So we have this situation where we have a family where the one person, the second generation, works in the business, adds a lot of value to the business, and there's temptation for resentment on both sides, right? The individual that works in the business could easily resent somebody who just receives distributions from the business but doesn't contribute to it at all. And somebody who receives distributions from the business but receives much smaller distributions than the person who works in the business could easily resent that person because they feel like they didn't have the opportunity to work in the business or run the business the way that other person did, that other sibling or cousin did. So it's very delicate, but you do need some economic incentive for the person who's in the business, and you need quantitative metrics to justify it, and recognize that it's not going to be perfect, but the goal is fairness and not necessarily equality of outcome when one person works in the business and one does not.
Yeah, and so take that a step further. Within each satellite, and I realize every family's different, every family business is different. Are there consistencies from family to family? In other words, is that dictated from the core, or are they very flexible in terms of, well, I'm going to, buy my children cars and houses and give them anything they want, as opposed to I'm going to be very strict and very frugal in how I'm going to, gift to my children or my grandchildren? Is it typical for them to those kind of core values and rules be dictated from the core, or is everyone on their own at the satellite level?
Yeah, I'll let Brian weigh in on that. I just have one quick thought on that. So I would say at the core level, it's very clearly adhering to the family values. At the satellite level, the family values are implied, they are encouraged, but rarely are they mandated, to the same degree that they are at the core level. Brian?
Yeah, I'd say that the Caleb answered it perfectly, that the core assets, if that's where the family business is being operated out of, I go more to the qualitative elements of this and how to prevent strain on the family dynamic. A lot of it has to do with creating a family office structure that supports the family business, that allows for family members to get the communication to be disseminated on what the strategy of the business is. That if you don't have that family office as a buffer, the family business is getting bogged down with a lot of distractions and a lot of influence from family dynamic issues. But if you have a family office that's supporting the family business, and it's a place for all the family members to come to for information about the business, you can bring them into the fold and bring them up to speed on strategic initiatives and explain why maybe some profits are being reinvested in the business instead of being distributed out, or why is this person that's working for the business being paid such a high salary. There's metrics that can prove that that's an industry level appropriate salary for someone, but someone that's not working for the business and not in the industry may not understand that. And to Caleb's point, that causes suspicion, it causes resentment at times, and major strain on the family dynamic. So our approach alongside the core satellite is also having a family office that can be that platform for family members to come to and kind of support that, allow the business to thrive and function without family dynamic creeping too far into it. And so that in some cases, families have large enough businesses where they can create their own single family offices, and then other times they come to a Whittier Trust, a multifamily office, and we serve in that role. So there's just an extra thought I had there, where the core satellite works too, but you should also have some family office elements in there.
Since we're talking about kind of how could the satellites operate, one of the other questions that was asked is, what is the best way to approach your family about a new business venture led by a next-gen family member? And I could see that happening within the satellites, right? As you talked about earlier, Caleb, you have someone who's an entrepreneur, wants to start their own business, wants to invest in a business. So maybe you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that all the time. And yeah, so there's a couple things to think about there. The first is that generally when the next generation or the third generation is thinking about a new business venture, they should probably walk before they run, right? And that might be a hard pill to swallow for somebody. And so it might be a difficult conversation, but it's an important conversation, right? The reality is 9 out of 10 or maybe more business ventures fail. The most successful people fail. They fail often. They fail many times. They just fail early, and they fail in a way that they can rebound and get back on their feet and make something happen later on. So the first thing I would say is sizing is important, and the greater the size of the request, the more scrutiny should be placed on it. The smaller the size of the request, the more it's potentially a learning opportunity. And so, yeah, so one thing that's helpful about this core satellite approach is often there are restrictions in place where it's not an automatic yes from the core to the satellite, right? So if I said if somebody's entrepreneurial, then they could take a distribution from the core, get it into the satellite, then everybody gets distributions into the satellite. But we've seen situations where somebody is clearly just trying to extract their interest of the core assets out of the core vehicle. And maybe they're buying a big grocery store or a big plot of land or something like that, where it's really not a scalable business venture. It's just a way of trying to shift their assets, and that can be denied, right? You can say there can be a decision maker who determines that that's not in the best interest of the overall family, and it's better to keep the assets invested collectively. So I actually think that there's a lot of good that can come from that question, right? If you have a family member who's saying the next generation wants to invest in some business venture, it's an opportunity. That's an opportunity for them to learn. It's for you as the previous generation to be curious about what they're doing, to go through the exercise of a business plan and walk through economics, compare the business venture that they have to a publicly traded company that's in a similar space that has financials that are out there and disclosed, and you can kind of walk through each line of the income statement or the cash flow statement, walk through the balance sheet and think about working capital. So you can get into the nitty gritty of really understanding a business, and that individual who's interested in the business venture can learn so much from that exercise. So I think it's what I see all too often is the first generation that is very reluctant to engage the second generation in a business venture, because they think, oh, it's it's, it's going to fail. It's not going to work. They're going to lose money. It's a distraction from becoming a doctor or lawyer or whatever it is. And I think it really should be embraced. It should be an opportunity to engage with that next generation and to have it be, a growth opportunity. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. Again, we see it all the time, and I think it's often a wasted opportunity, and it should be a learning exercise for both G1 and G2.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And you're right. Is it too many grandparents, parents kind of poo-poo what the next generation is coming up with in terms of ventures or ideas? And if they treat it as a learning experience, like you just articulated, it would make life so much easier for everybody. And you can build structures, as you talked about, around what does a new venture have to look like? What are the rules? What's the process? What's the procedure for presenting it and ultimately investing in it? So I think that's a great answer. So since we're at this point, I'm also going to ask about the practicality of putting this structure in place. Because one of the questions from one of the individuals that registered was, can I do this with $10 million or less? Or what's the number, the size of the assets or the family business do I need to have in order to put the structure in place?
So I just shifted slides to show, and I think it's a perfect question for this slide to help answer, because the starting point here is $10 million. And so where today you're thinking, I'm below the lifetime exemption amount, what does it really matter to utilize a strategy like this and try to move assets outside of the taxable estate? And what this graph is showing is just the impact that estate tax can have on the compound growth of an asset. So if you're starting at $10 million and just growing at a modest 7.7% annual growth rate, you can follow the blue line if you're outside of the taxable estate and not letting the IRS take the 40% bite at each generation. You can see just the astounding growth that occurs from just a $10 million starting point. And if you don't enact this strategy and you just keep it inside the taxable estate at each generation, you can just see that it makes for me, an eye-popping difference. And so I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Caleb.
Yeah, I think you're right. The benefit is maximized if you're a larger estate, but if you're 10 million and growing, you should be thinking about this as well.
So I wanted to comment on this as well. Caleb, you mentioned about the estate tax exemption at an all-time high. Before I make that comment, I would just like to remind everybody, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. We have time for that. We'd love to hear from you all. So again, just a reminder, put them in the Q&A in the chat, and I'll attempt to manage that as well. So I think this is a really, really important slide, and I would just comment that this exemption that both of you have talked about, and Brian, you particularly, the estate tax exemption at an all-time high of 13 million plus per person, double per couple, is going to expire at the end of 2025. And not that I have any better crystal ball than anybody, but with all the work that we've done in Washington, D.C. for over 30 years now, I really believe that exemption is not going to be anywhere near that level. It's very possible it could be as low as 5 million or even lower. And I think the reason for that is not necessarily political, even of course, everything that's done in DC is political, but it's really based on where our debt is today. And it's all about, revenues and expenses, just like in our business world. So I really think that this exemption, there isn't a strong push to keep it where it is. We're pushing very hard. We're working on it now because we believe it's so very, very important to keep this exemption where it is, helps so many families in America. But I am very concerned that it's going to be substantially lower. So I cannot emphasize enough that people, if you haven't taken advantage of this exemption, you need to do it right away. I say this all the time. People are probably tired of me hearing about it, but I mean, talking about it, but you have to take advantage of it. And if you wait till next year, mid next year, all the estate attorneys and all the people like Caleb and Brian are not going to have time to deal with it. They're going to have so much work to be done. So really, really get on it as soon as possible and understand that it is very likely not going to be at this level. So we do have a question in the chat, and it said, what are the implications of institutional trustees versus family members at the core or satellite level? That's a great question. Which one of you want to start on that?
I can start with that one. I think both we've seen work with some success. I think the benefit to an institutional trustee is that you never have to worry about that institution, aging or going to retirement or losing capacity. I think in all estate plans, there should be an institutional trustee as a backstop, that if the individual's your best friend or your brother can serve initially, there should always be that, evergreen solution is as the backstop. So when the person that you name, but I can't tell you how many times we look at trusts and we review trusts with our clients, and the people they've named, they're like, well, that person's not alive anymore, and that person doesn't make sense anymore because of X, Y, or Z. There's some benefit to a professional institutional trustee that you can count on for multiple generations. But I get that sometimes the brother or the best friend is the right person at a certain point in time, and or maybe it's the non-family business executive that the family really trusts. He just understands the business and is chairman of the board. That we've seen those types serve as the trustee of those types of core vehicles that we've been discussing, and to great success as well. So I think both work, but I think obviously the institutional has a longer lifespan.
How about co-trustees? Because I sometimes have thought that's a good answer if you want to have kind of a little bit of both, right? You want to make sure the family has a voice in how the trust is being administered, but they may not have, to your point, the financial expertise. So you have a co-trustee with an institution and a family member, or maybe you have two family members in an institution or whatever. How have you found that solution?
We've seen that work very well. And I think that is a really good solution. The other position that's become a lot more popular these days is the trust protector. So always having an individual within the family as the trust protector that has the power to fire or change who the institutional trustee is, which we've seen that gain a lot of popularity lately.
Yeah, that's a great solution as well. I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of people still have not heard of trust protectors, and even though they've been around for a long time, great solution. We do have another question, not in the chat, but it was asked from someone who registered. I'm not sure. I think this is really more based on your experience working with families, both of you. So what are the most frequently ownership complications overlooked by families?
My initial thought is just the expansion of the family tree. I think in our experience, the early generations, it's a much easier succession plan from Gen 1 to Gen 2, and your mother and father to the three siblings. I think the ownership of a family business into Generation 6, where there's hundreds of family members, I just think that the fanning out and the expansion in numbers of stakeholders and shareholders is one of the biggest complexities we see.
Caleb, do you have a comment about that?
I think Brian answered it well. I think, yeah, it ties back to what I mentioned earlier, where one person or multiple people work in the business and others do not. And I think that is a complication that really needs to be thought through and you need to provide clarity and rationale for how the compensation structure is going to be different. We worked with a family where transparency was an issue initially, and if you don't tell somebody, then they make up their own story, right? And their imagination is often worse than reality. So we found it was better to just be fully transparent.
I know we're talking about this core satellite approach to estate planning, and it's been fascinating, but you also mentioned family office earlier. And so I think a family office is obviously probably the best equipped to put this kind of strategy in place. So let's talk a little bit about family offices, because someone did ask this question, what are the biggest challenges facing family offices? But maybe you can answer the question in the sense of the work that you're doing for your clients now, maybe around this strategy or maybe around other things that you see in big demand from your clients today.
Yes, I think first we should define the family office for some people. There's the idea of a single family office, and that's actually how Whittier Trust started. That's our origin story. We were the single family office for the Whittier family. And at the time, this was 1935, they had a full operating oil and gas business. And so the family office really helped be that platform for the family members to engage in family related issues and be informed about the business. And then when they sold their operating family business, they had a major liquidity event in 1979, sold their oil and gas business to Shell. Then that family office, the function changed into more of a wealth management, and they still had a lot of shared assets. And whenever there's a lot of family members that need to come together and have joint decision making, the family office really is the platform that family members can come to, and it really helps organize a family around shared assets and joint decision making. And it helps alleviate that function from the operating family business that has its own set of challenges just surviving as a business, just the day-to-day challenges businesses face. So to put the function and thinking about strategic estate planning, quarterly meetings to shareholder meetings, it's that type of function. And we've seen a trend where a lot of single family offices are starting to look at the cost of setting that up or the cost of maintaining it and saying, look, we need an office space to house and support the staff, and the staff is growing in size, or the staff is nearing retirement and we're going to have to hire someone new. And just the HR headache of it all, they're looking to companies like ours where they can just plug into the multifamily office platform and still have that family office experience. They come and use our conference rooms, they utilize our resources, sometimes the CFO of our company sits in with the board of directors of the family business and weighs in, or the head of our tax department, head of our legal team. So it's kind of a way of sharing the cost of a single family office is plugging into a platform like ours.
So in the interest of time, we have a few minutes left, but we do have a question in the chat from Nancy. I think it's a great question also. If the assets are moved out of the taxable estate of the first generation through the core entity, how does the first generation live off the assets?
Caleb, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, one that the first generation often, kind of has trouble wrapping their head around, because you are transferring a lot of assets. But there's a number of ways to do it. So could be through an intrafamily note, could be through an installment sale, could be, retaining a beneficial interest in a trust. So there's a number of ways to do it, but the gist is that it's common, happens all the time, and there are ways to move assets but retain the cash flow. So You can, there's estate freezing techniques where you freeze the value of the estate and then the appreciation goes into that core vehicle or to the next generation. So that there's a number of ways to do it, but that's not it's generally not the problem, right? There's, like I said, there's many solutions on how to retain the cash flow and retain living off the assets when moving assets outside of the taxable estate.
So in this last minute or so, do either of you have any closing remarks that you would like to make?
I'd just say that, we were thinking of this audience as being a lot of family business owners, and just that, the challenges you guys face, we empathize with you. It's hard enough to run a business and be successful and compete against, the massive Amazons of the world, or whoever you're competing against, to also have to think about paying this estate tax at each generation. So we empathize with you, and we're definitely here to help if you just want to brainstorm and think about how to take advantage of some opportunities before 2025 comes around.
Yeah, hopefully we planted a seed or two, and some of it resonated and is familiar as an objective or goal that you're trying to accomplish, and gave you some insight into how other families are facing those challenges and overcoming those hurdles to achieve the objectives they want. And just thank you, and thank you, Pat. Thank you to the Family Enterprise USA.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Caleb. I think it's fascinating. I really appreciate you getting on this webcast for us today, and also really appreciate Whittier Trust and its sponsorship and support of Family Enterprise USA. Also have to thank everyone who joined us today. Hope you enjoyed it. We're going to send this recording out to our entire database. So if you're part of that database, you'll get to watch it again if you would like to do so. And we also place it on our YouTube channel. So once again, Brian, Caleb, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you that joined for the call. Take care, everyone.